Hello, I'm Michael Topham, technical writer for digital photo, and welcome to this video lesson that's going to show you how to combine a series of photographs together in your imaging software to create an effective multi-image montage. A successful looking montage is made up of many components, but first of all you'll need to find a strong subject to photograph. Now the subject that you decide to use for your montage is completely up to you, but it should always contain plenty of small details, as it's these that will be blended around the outside of your main image and make your montage stand out from all the rest. We've picked out 6 images to use in our final montage from a wide selection of shots that we've taken at a preserved steam railway, and you'll find these in the Start Images folder on the CD. Be sure to follow this technique with the Start Images, and then you'll be ready to give this technique a try on a set of your own photographs. To start off, I've opened up Elements onto my screen, but if you're a Photoshop user, don't worry, as this video tutorial is also compatible for you. So to start off, I'm just going to close down this final montage image on my screen and load up the first image that we're going to be dealing with, which is called locomotive.jpg. So as you can see, I've opened up locomotive.jpg from the CD, and this is the photograph that we're going to be using as our main background image for the montage. We're now ready to open up the first image that we're looking to add to the montage, and to do this you'll be looking for a file called engineman.jpg from the CD. So I'm just going to open up my engineman file, engineman.jpg, and I'm just going to load this up into Elements. Just head up to the top left of your toolbox and select on the Move tool, and then very easily just hold down inside the engineman.jpg file and just drag this across onto the locomotive.jpg file. Now you may have noticed that Elements will leave the original image on our screen, but we can safely close that down without saving it, so I'm just going to go back to the original engineman.jpg image and just close that down without saving it, and that will leave us with a little bit more room to maneuver on our screen. Now the next step is to make sure that you can see your layers palette nice and clearly on your screen, but don't worry if you can't, because you can just easily go up to Window in the menu bar and then go down and click on Layers, and it will appear on your screen for you. And if we just have a little look in our layers palette, we can see that we've got 2 layers in our image. We've got our main background image that we're using for the montage, and we've also got our portrait image that we dragged across a moment ago. Now at the moment we can see that this portrait is rather large in our montage, and I'm looking to make it just a little bit smaller. So to do this, just make sure that you're selected on layer 1 in your layers palette, and then just go up to Image, down to Transform, across and onto Free Transform, or equally you could have pressed Ctrl and T on your keyboard. Just make sure that Constrain Proportions is ticked in the options bar, and then just take hold of one of these top corner handles and just slowly bring it down so it's a little bit smaller, and then just hold down within the image and move it towards the right hand side. So I'm looking to move my engineman into place somewhere around there, and I might just move the cursor beneath the free transform box and just rotate him very slightly. So he's looking up a little bit further in the frame. I'm just going to move him down. You can take a bit of care and time over this, moving your montage elements into the right position, and when you're happy with your portrait and where it's actually sitting in the main montage image, just hit Enter on your keyboard to confirm. So having rescaled our portrait image onto our main background montage image, we're now ready to get rid of this noticeable edge that we can see around the outside of layer 1. To do this, we'll be using the Eraser tool, but firstly I'm just going to drag in my layers palette just to show you that I'm selected on layer 1. So make sure that in your layers palette that you are also selected on layer 1. Head across to your toolbox and you'll find the eraser about halfway down in the toolbox. Just give that a click, and then move up to your options bar and just click on this little arrow here to select a soft brush. Now I'm going to choose a brush of around 300 pixels, which is a nice soft brush to use. So as we can see in our options bar there, it's got 300 pixels set. Make sure your mode is set to brush, and for the meantime we're going to use an opacity of 100%. Begin to brush slowly on the image, and as you do so, you'll see that we're erasing the pixels of the engineman image and revealing the pixels from the locomotive image beneath. It's important at this stage that you don't get too close to the portrait and just run the eraser carefully around the outside of the portrait, as we'll use a lower opacity brush to erase around the outline of this engineman. So notice how I'm just brushing around this engineman, not getting too close to him at the moment because we'll use a different opacity for that. So I'm just brushing around the whole of the outside of the image. I can just zoom out slightly by pressing Ctrl and minus on my screen, and I'm just going to drag this out a little bit. There we go. And with the same brush, I'm just going to brush carefully around the outside of this engineman. As we can see, we're just allowing some of those pixels to show through from the layer beneath. And as we just go round, we'll just tidy that up a little bit like so, not getting too close, and then we'll leave it like that for a minute. So with the main erasing done, I'll just go back up into my options bar and just change a few of my settings. I'm going to lower the opacity, so when we go around a little bit closer to this engineman, we'll get a much neater and tidier blend, and I'm going to drop my opacity right down to about 25%. You also need to decrease the size of your brush, and you can do this very easily by pressing the left hand side square bracket key on your keyboard, or equally you can actually adjust the size of your brush in the options bar. I'm going to go for a brush of around 175 pixels for the meantime, and then I need to zoom back into my image, and I can do that very easily by pressing Ctrl and plus on my keyboard a few times. So with my new eraser settings, I can now concentrate on going a little bit more closely towards this engineman, and it takes a little bit of time just brushing carefully around this engineman, just getting a little bit closer towards his jacket there, and we can see that we're bringing through pixels from the layer beneath. So we're just allowing a few pixels to show through, and then as we move up, I've just got my hand on the space bar there, just moving up through the image with the hand tool. We can just slowly brush back the detail of the engine around the engineman's face. Make sure that you take a little bit of time and care with your blending, as it's this effect that will really make the image look fantastic at the end result. So I'm just very carefully just going around the edge of the engineman's skin there, just moving up through the image by holding down spacebar on my keyboard like so, and just very, very carefully just brushing up against the engineman there with the eraser. So as we move up through the image, we're just allowing a little bit more information to show of that locomotive, and just carefully keep doing this all the way around the outside of this engineman. Now if you do make a mistake with your eraser, that's no problem, and you can easily make a step backwards. Just go up to Window and then down to Undo History, and make a few steps back in your undo history, and then start again. Now it's going to take me a few minutes just to get this natural blend between the engineman and the locomotive as I just slowly work my way around. Don't forget that you can also change the size of your brush. There's no need to stay at 175 pixels, so I can do that by pressing my left hand square brackets key, just reducing the size slightly and getting into these slightly tighter areas. And then I'm just going to slowly work around the outside of my image like so, using the spacebar with the hand tool, and as I'm just slowly moving around, you can begin to see how I'm brushing back that detail. I'll rejoin you in a minute once I've brushed around the whole of the outside of this engineman. So I've carefully and successfully blended my first image, this engineman, into my montage with thanks to the eraser tool, and now it's looking very effective. We're ready to bring in the next photograph into the montage. Open up pressure gauge.jpg from the CD, and just like we did with the engineman.jpg, we need to drag and drop this image into our main montage document. So if we remember what we did before, we went across to the toolbox and picked out the move tool, and then just hold down inside this pressure gauge image and very simply just drag that on top of our montage. And then we can just close down the original pressure gauge image file because we don't need that any longer. So I'm just going to close that down and we don't need to save it. And then we can concentrate on our main montage image again. With layer number 2 selected in your layers palette, just hit Ctrl and T on your keyboard to enter free transform mode, and then just position this pressure gauge rather neatly up towards the top left hand corner of the frame. And I'll just move my layers palette out the way there to give us a little bit more room, and just rescale it to size if you need to, making sure you've got constrained proportions ticked in the options bar. So I'm just going to make it a little bit smaller like so, and maybe just rotate it just that little bit like that. So just move it into shape, and then when you're happy with this positioning of this new layer, layer number 2, just hit enter to confirm that free transform. So with the new element on our montage, the pressure gauge, we can think about blending this into our main image. And if I just bring in my layers palette, you'll be able to see how I'm now going to change the blending mode of this layer. Make sure that you're selected on layer number 2 from the layers palette, and then just head up to this little arrow where it says normal, and we're going to change the blending mode of layer number 2 to hard light. So just scroll down through the list until you find hard light, give that a click, and then we're now going to be ready to actually brush away these harsh edges once again with the eraser tool. Making sure that you're selected on layer number 2, just slowly brush onto the image and just reveal the pixels beneath. So as we can see, we're just allowing that portrait to show through a little bit more clearly, and we're just starting to allow that locomotive beneath to show through. So I'm just brushing carefully around this pressure gauge, just showing and bringing back a little bit of detail of the locomotive's wheels there. And there we go, and we're just going to brush this carefully around the outside of the pressure gauge. We can just zoom in a little bit more closely by pressing Ctrl and plus on our keyboard, holding down spacebar to move across to the pressure gauge, and then what we'll do is we'll actually reduce the opacity like we did with when we blended the actual engine. We'll just reduce the opacity down to around 25% or so, and then we'll just brush carefully around the outside of this pressure gauge just to get a nice seamless blend. So once you've run this lower opacity eraser around your pressure gauge, it should start to look a little bit like this. And then all I'm going to do, just to smarten this up a little bit more, is I'm just going to bring back my layers palette, and I'm just going to move this layer 2 just very slightly up towards the north of the image. So I'm just going to go back and use the move tool. I'm just going to move it a little bit further up in the image, somewhere like that, making sure that we can still see the nameplate of the locomotive, just carefully moving it into position. So I think I want my pressure gauge to sit just about there, just a little bit further up in my montage. We can now begin to see that our montage is taking shape, and we now have 3 layers that we can see in our layers palette. And before things get any more confusing, let's rename our layers in our layers palette so we know exactly what each layer represents. This is very easy to do. We just need to double click on the layer itself, and then we can actually input a new name for that layer. So I'm just going to call this layer Engineman, because we know that this is the actual Engineman. Just hit enter to confirm that, and then just go up to layer number 2, and I'm going to rename layer number 2 as pressure gauge, just double clicking on the layer thumbnail there. So I'm just going to call it pressure gauge. There we go. And once we've done that, we can see that we've renamed those layers there, and we now know what they represent. We're now ready to bring in the next image into the montage, and the next image that we're going to bring in is called injector.jpg. With the injector.jpg image up on our screen, we can now move this into our montage in the same way that we did it with our pressure gauge and our engineman. So just go across to the toolbox, pick out the move tool, and just move this injector.jpg file across onto the montage. And then once you've done that, we can just close down the original injector.jpg file, as that is no longer needed. So with this new file that we've dragged and dropped onto our montage, we can rename it in our layers palette by double clicking on layer number 1, and I'm just going to call it injector, and just hit enter on the keyboard, and then we can concentrate on rescaling this injector to size, and I'm going to move it down towards the bottom left of my montage. Just hit Ctrl and T to enter free transform, and then just make this injector image just that little bit smaller, and then just move it down towards the bottom left of the image. And I'm looking to line it up roughly around there, just make it a little bit smaller maybe. Something just about there. I'm quite happy with that positioning, so I'll just hit enter on my keyboard. Now, like we did with the pressure gauge, I'm actually going to change the blending mode of this layer to hard light, and we can do that by making sure injector is selected from the layers palette, just clicking on this little arrow next to normal, and then go down and click on hard light, and we can see that the blending mode of that layer has been changed. We can still see that there's quite a noticeable edge around the outside of this image that we've dragged in, so we now need to remove that with the eraser like we did with the two other elements in the montage. We just need to brush away these unwanted edges with the eraser once again. So make sure you've got quite a large brush to start off with the eraser selected in the toolbox, and then just very slowly just brush away those edges like I am. And then just once we've done that, we just brush away the edges. We can just reduce the opacity back down to 25% or so, something like that, and then we'll just zoom back into the image by pressing Ctrl and plus on the keyboard, just to make sure that we get a seamless blend between the text here and the locomotive behind it. Once you've carefully gone around the wheels of this locomotive, with the eraser tool just bringing back a little bit of information from the layers beneath the injector layer, we can zoom out just to see how the blend is looking. And yes, that is starting to look very good. I'll just move my layers palette back out of the way, and we can really see that our montage image is really taking shape. We now have two more elements to input into this montage, and the next photograph that you'll want to open up is called brlogo.jpg. Once you've got the brlogo.jpg file open on your screen, you can just use the move tool again and just drag this element into our montage like we did earlier with all the other elements, and there we go, we can see that that's been moved across, and then likewise just close down this actual brlogo.jpg file, and there's no need to save that. Dragging in a new photograph obviously creates a new layer in our layers palette. And whilst we remember, let's always rename a layer as we drag it in. So we know that this is the BR logo, so let's just rename that by double clicking on the layer there and just rename it BR logo. Making sure that this layer is selected, hit Ctrl and T once again on the keyboard, and then make sure constrain proportions is ticked, and let's just reduce the size of this logo because at the moment it's looking rather large. Just move the logo carefully into place. So I think I want the logo roughly around here, and I think also I might just rotate it slightly just to give it a bit more of a unique angle. So I think I'm just going to place it somewhere around there, just on the kind of engineman's jacket. I'm just going to decrease the size very slightly. When you're happy with that, either hit enter on the keyboard or just tick the green tick. Once again, use the eraser to allow through the pixels beneath the BR logo and just brush very carefully around the outside of the logo, just like I am, brushing up carefully next to it with an opacity of 100%, and then superfine your blend with a lower opacity. So I'm just brushing very carefully up against this BR logo layer. So I'm just brushing around like so, and then as you get a little bit closer, we can drop the opacity down to 25% or so. Maybe just reduce the brush size slightly by hitting the left hand side square brackets key. You see the brush size is just reducing there, and then just get a little bit closer to the logo, just brushing in and around it to create a seamless blend. And once you're happy with that, we'll actually just reduce the opacity of this layer very, very slightly to allow through a little bit of detail beneath the BR logo and just to show through the jacket beneath. Once you've carefully run the eraser around the outside of this logo, you can just reduce the opacity of this layer to show through a little bit of detail beneath it. So we can actually allow through a little bit of detail of this engineman's coat and jacket. So just go into your layers palette, make sure BR logo is selected, and just reduce the opacity slider down to around 60 or 50%. The last photograph that will make up this montage is called nameplate.jpg, and you'll find that on the CD, and just open that up, and likewise we're now going to blend that into the montage. So with the nameplate open on my screen, we can just go into the move tool once again, and then just simply drag and drop that onto our montage like so. And in our layers palette you'll see we've got another layer, and we need to rename this layer 1 that we've just dragged and dropped in with nameplate. So I'm just going to rename that layer there nameplate. Using the same techniques as shown earlier, I'm just very simply going to move this to exactly where I think it should be. Now I'm going to put it up towards the top of the image there, like so, and then just resize it if I need to with Control and T with the free transform. I'm just going to make it a little bit smaller and just locate it where I think it wants to be, just somewhere up at the top of the image there, and then just hit the green tick to confirm your placement. Once again, we want to show through the information beneath this layer, and the best way of doing that is by using the eraser tool. Now start off, of course, with a opacity of around 100% and a slightly bigger brush, of course, so we're going to go up to around 300 or so, 250 will be fine, and then just slowly brush away that information there, revealing what's underneath this layer, which will be the engine, the pressure gauge, and the engineman. So I'm just brushing very carefully towards the tip of that nameplate, not getting too close, just carefully running the eraser around it like so. And then as we get a little bit closer, we can just zoom in slightly to perfect our blend. And then I'm just going to reduce the opacity right down to 25 again, and then just brush a little bit more closely to get a very natural blend between the nameplate, the locomotive, the engineman, and of course the pressure gauge over towards the left hand side of our montage. Once you've run around the whole of the nameplate very carefully with a lower opacity and a smaller brush with the eraser tool, we can now change the blending mode of this layer. So just make sure you've got nameplate set and highlighted in the layers palette, and we're just going to change this again to hard light. So we've changed that to hard light, and that's starting to look really, really good. But the actual nameplate is just overlapping the engineman's hat there. So all I'm going to do is I'm just going to zoom back in a little bit more closely, use the spacebar just to move up through the image, and I'm just going to use the eraser once more just to slowly bring back a little bit of detail in that area of the engineman's hat. It's this kind of detailing work that will actually make up your montage and make it stand out from all the others. So just carefully make a few clicks there, just bringing back the detail of the badge and just sending the nameplate behind the engineman's hat. Now I've done a little bit of careful erasing there just to make it look like the engineman's hat is standing out in front of the nameplate. But the main problem at the moment is that the nameplate is much too dominant. It's much too clear, and I'm going to make that a little bit more subtle by reducing the opacity of the nameplate layer. So just make sure you've got the nameplate layer highlighted in the layers palette, and like we did with the BR logo layer, we're just going to reduce that back right down to around 30%. So there we are, we've taken 6 photographs from a trip to a preserved railway and then combined them all together to make this absolutely stunning montage. But the most important step is to actually save this montage as a PSD file, which will mean that you can return at any stage should you want to make any adjustments to any of the layers in your layers palette. So to save it as a PSD, just go up to File in the menu bar, down to Save As, pick exactly where you want to save the file, and actually make sure that you choose that you're saving it as a format of a Photoshop PSD file, and this will save the layers. Just make sure you've got layers ticked under the save, click save, and that will mean you can go back to the image and make any further adjustments should you need to at any time. Once you've saved your montage as a PSD, a Photoshop file, the last step involves adding a sepia-toned effect to the montage, which will give it an atmospheric look. We will then bring back hints of the original colour by reducing the opacity of the hue and saturation adjustment layer that we make. So, to add this atmospheric effect, we firstly need to flatten all those layers that we dragged in to make our montage. And that's very simple to do. You just go up to Layer in the menu bar, and then all the way down to Flatten Image, and that will crunch all those layers that we had in our Layers palette down into one. With that done, just head up towards the top of the Layers palette, and just hover over the Create Adjustment Layer icon, which is a circle with half black, half white in it. Just give that a click, and then scroll down and click on Hue and Saturation. The Hue and Saturation dialog box will pop up onto your screen, and just make sure you tick Colorize before setting your hue to 20. So I'm just going to move this slider very carefully towards the right, or equally you could just type in the value there, and then just set your saturation just down towards 15%. And to apply this, just head up and click OK, and you'll see that hue and saturation adjustment layer in your layers palette. So we can see that the sepia effect has been applied to the whole montage, but to bring back a hint of the original colour is very easy. Just head up towards the top of the layers palette, making sure your hue and saturation adjustment layer is highlighted, and then again just click on this little drop down arrow next to the opacity to load up the opacity slider, and then just move this slider very carefully back towards the left, and as you do so you'll begin to see that we're allowing a tiny bit of colour back through, and I'm going to set my opacity to around 60%. If you're looking for a more powerful sepia toned effect, I suggest that you go for an opacity of around 80%. And then just to apply that, either hit enter on your keyboard or just click on the little downwards arrow once again. It's very important now to save this new montage with this sepia toned effect with a new file name. Otherwise you're going to be saving over your original montage and you'll lose all those previous layers. So at this point, very critically, go up to File, down to Save As, and then make sure you find your folder where you want to save your montage and save it with a new name. So I'm going to call mine montagesepia.psd, so I'm saving that hue and adjustment layer that we actually just made there. So it's got a new name, and I won't be saving it over the locomotive PSD that I created for the final montage. So once you've typed in a new name, just click Save, and therefore you're happy to know that you've now got 2 saved documents. And there we are. We've successfully assembled an atmospheric montage in Elements with a series of different images. Why not give this technique a try for yourself to see how effective it really is? And once you've got to grips with the technique of blending layers, changing blending modes, and reducing the opacity of a layer, you'll be ready to apply the same technique on a set of your own images. I hope you've enjoyed this montage video, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon.